Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for sitting through that video. I believe we do have Tracey on the line. So before I do introduce her, Tracey and I go back. I think I might have met her about 6 years ago in her previous role at the Centre for Environmental Rights. She has since been operating at Just Share, I believe the founder there, and they have really become a voice for shareholder activism in South Africa and playing in the public space, being very brave and vocal and calling out companies for their injustices and their shortcomings. So Tracey, if you can hear me, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, David. Good morning, and good morning to everyone who's listening.
Excellent. I can see you for the first time. This is fantastic. I just want to open up by looking at the current state of affairs and the impact that the elephant in the room, COVID, has had and the subsequent lockdown on employment. We often read about the disproportionate effect of job losses on women in particular. And do the real world facts support this? And in your view, what are the main reasons behind this?
They do. Global statistics really bear this out. Institutions like the International Labour Organization and the World Bank, which of course are tracking this all the time, have kind of repeatedly warned of the outsized impacts that COVID is having on women. Women make up about 39% of the global workforce, but estimates are that they account for 54% of job losses since the start of the COVID-induced lockdowns. Of course, this is partly because they're more likely to work in the hardest hit industries like hospitality, and perhaps more relevant maybe for your viewers, they bear a disproportionate burden of the school closures and the office closures. So obviously, if you've got children at home requiring homeschooling and a full-time job, that is not an easy thing to manage. And I think there's been a fair number of women who, if they are privileged enough to be able to do so, have had to choose between those two options. And of course, children will inevitably be what they choose. In South Africa, researchers estimate that there were approximately 3 million jobs lost in our first hard lockdown last year, and around 2 million of them were women, mostly in manual and domestic labor, where employment is precarious at the best of times. And I'm sure, we all heard really sad and awful anecdotes about people who simply were told they couldn't come back to work or that they wouldn't be paid during the COVID lockdowns when they weren't able to come to work. So certainly an outsized impact, an enduring impact, and possibly one that will reverse some of the progress that's been made on this in recent years.
Thank you so much, Tracey. And we did have a slide earlier that showed gender participation at national government level, as well as a few kind of select companies here in South Africa. But before we go deep into terms of what has been done to progress gender participation, what are the current guidelines in place for businesses to play their part in terms of benefiting from this equitable participation?
Well, beyond our various BEE sort of frameworks, which are obviously not gender specific, there are very few requirements around gender or race diversity at companies, and particularly listed companies, which is what we focus on. So the JSE only introduced any rules on this into its listings requirements in 2017 and 2018. Not particularly demanding requirements. Companies with a primary listing on the JSE must have a policy in place on gender and board diversity, and must report to shareholders on voluntary targets and where they are in achieving those targets. Just to pick up on your comment earlier, it's important to note that this is applicable to board level only. It's not dealing with senior executives. And certainly when you look at South African listed companies, you can see that while progress has definitely been made at board level, it's much less diverse at the senior management level. These policies, some problems with this requirement are that they don't have to be publicly available. So we see companies talking in their annual reports about policies and targets, saying that they've achieved their targets. But in many cases, you can't actually access the policies themselves. So it's difficult to assess exactly what they're setting out to achieve. There's also no requirement that those policies be updated or revised. So we see many companies saying year after year after year that they've achieved targets that were set and met some time ago. Just to give you an example of this, and I certainly don't mean to pick on them because they are not by any means the worst. They're just an example that we encountered recently, and it was quite stark. And that's the SPAR Group, who adopted a board diversity policy in August 2018 with a minimum target of 3 Black people on the board and 2 women. When that policy was adopted, they'd already achieved those targets quite some time before, and nothing's changed since. So every year the company reports that they've achieved their board diversity targets, but it's questionable whether that is actually achieving anything. Should we be able to set targets that we've already met? And then, of course, the JSE doesn't monitor or enforce this requirement. It says that it's up to shareholders to do so. It's encouraging to see the results of your responsible investment survey that say that asset managers are engaging with companies on this issue. It's certainly not something that they speak about in public. Although I think the recent situation with ABSA and the departure of the ABSA CEO is indicative perhaps of a change in approach, because there's really been quite a strong reaction to that departure and to what it says about culture and diversity within that organization. I could speak about the 30% Club report for a second, or did you want to move on to that in the next question?
No, absolutely. Go. Continue. I think when we chatted a couple of weeks ago, I'd heard about 30% Club for the first time, and I know you had some interesting insights on that.
Yeah, so the 30% Club it was started in the UK in 2016. It has 16 regional and country chapters, of which South Africa is one. And its mission is to achieve at least 30% female representation on boards and in C-suites globally by 2020. That was last year, and I can tell you that target was not achieved in very many places, and certainly not globally. The 30% target was chosen. I always find it interesting that the target is 30% when women account for more than 50% of the population. But the kind of the underlying rationale for that, similar to the research that you spoke about in relation to the European parliamentary requirements, is that research suggests that 30% represents a critical mass from which point minority groups can impact the boardroom dynamics. So that's where that 30% number comes from. In any event, by last year, only 3 of the 16 chapters had reached the target. In South Africa, 24% of board members are women. They make up 13% of executive directors and only 28% of non-execs. And so the board assessed the gender composition of 219 JSE listed companies and claimed to be answering questions such as, why are there not more women on the boards of listed companies? And my personal favorite, are there enough women of the right caliber to fill board positions as they arise?
I know we did have a chuckle when you mentioned that on our call a couple of weeks ago, that argument is getting a little bit archaic. And I know I've done a bit of background research on some of the articles that you've written, and there is some academic research at least support that is an absurd comment.
Well, I mean, the fact that the question is asked, especially by an organization that's supposed to be progressing this agenda, I think is quite concerning. The fact that we still have to ask ourselves, is it true that women can make a positive contribution to our economy is quite an extraordinary question to me in this day and age. But nevertheless, it is regularly asked. And there is a lot of research to support the fact that the problem is not that there are not enough qualified women out there. So just to give you one example, last year, a paper by the University of Stellenbosch Business School provided a vast array of statistics to support its assertion that there is, and I'm quoting, a vast untapped pool of qualified and talented women who could add value to a board. So the problem is not that there aren't enough qualified women. The problem is that they're not being appointed. And even the 30% Club report confirms that it's still common practice for board members to nominate or recommend individuals that they know or are close to based on their own networks, and also that boards only recruit individuals who they consider to be highly experienced and seasoned. But of course, if you're not getting the opportunity to become experienced, you end up in a vicious cycle where you never actually qualify for that role.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned those JSE listing requirements. I think they've been quite progressive. The current CEO is obviously a female, and then Nikki Newton-King was there before her as well. So they're one of those few rare beasts on the JSE with a female leader. I want to park the representation discussion aside for the final question and talk to something that is probably equally as telling, and that is the pay gap. It is well known that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. I think our Gini coefficient might even say we are the most unequal country in the world. But you've cited historically some interesting research that inclusive growth benefits not just the poor, but the wealthy as well, in ways that may not at first appear obvious.
Yeah, I think we often have this conversation kind of backwards in South Africa. So we say, we have this huge inequality, and the solution to that economy is to the solution to that inequality is to really make sure that the people who are seen to be the ones who have the most potential to create jobs, in other words, particularly big companies and particularly the leaders of those big companies, are really kind of cosseted and paid more and more and more and more in order to ensure that they sort of don't run away and leave us in the lurch. But you know, and that if we do that, then more jobs will be created, and we'll have, you know, we'll start having more impressive economic growth. But actually, inequality in and of itself is something that stops us from experiencing better economic growth. And global research shows that the unequal societies are more violent, have less stable and slower growing economies, poorer levels of education, and societies in which citizens are less likely to trust each other and to participate in public and communal life, which of course impacts the ability to govern and impacts the ability to set policies that might reduce that inequality. So in South Africa, this question of wage inequality has really deep historical roots, and arguably it has the most dramatic economic and social repercussions, this huge wage gap that we see throughout our society. You know, more than 20 years ago, in some research I was doing earlier this year, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, in its final report to Nelson Mandela, called the gap between rich and poor in South Africa morally reprehensible, politically dangerous, and economically unsound. And what's happened in the 20 years since then? Well, the incomes of the top 5% in South Africa have grown at more than double the rate of economic growth, and the incomes of the remaining 95% of people have either stagnated or grown really, really slowly. And the real incomes of the top 1% over the past 15 years have almost doubled. So the top 1% in this country have increased their share of total income to more than 12%. Now, that is in and of itself a contributor to increasing inequality in our country. And so the extraordinary fact that in South Africa, we don't have mandatory wage gap disclosure. And so we spend all our time, sort of picking over, having these incredibly complex arguments about complicated remuneration packages for the highest paid people in our society. We don't talk about what we need to pay those at the lower levels of those companies to ensure that they have a dignified life. And tackling inequality doesn't just mean making sure everyone can scrape by with a minimum wage, which, as you know, is fought tooth and nail every time it's mentioned. It also means taking concerted action to close the gap between the top and the bottom. And we really need to ask ourselves in South Africa, how much does one person really need to live well? And how can we better share the prosperity of our society, because there is a lot of prosperity in this country, to improve the well-being and respect the dignity of the poor? Because we do have to recognize that although, and I'm not detracting from the extraordinarily valuable role that CEOs and executives play in our economy, but value creation is attributable to a vast swathe of our society, not just to 4 or 5, usually white men at the top of industry. And we need to figure out how we can start having a conversation about how to better distribute that prosperity in our society.
Thank you, Tracey. And I know at Just Share you're obviously champions of just greater transparency and disclosure from corporates. And you mentioned earlier the pay gap ratio. So that's looking at the CEO's pay versus the mean worker's pay and what is the multiple there. Have any companies actually come forward and published this? Or is it sitting on your hands and waiting for the first person to do so?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, we'll see many companies claim, for example, that they pay all their staff a living wage. We'll see companies saying things like, we pay our staff 3 times the minimum wage, or, that kind of thing. But there's no interrogation of what do you consider to be an unfair wage gap? Give us the figures at the bottom of your company so we can tell whether this is or isn't an unfair wage gap. There is legislation being proposed. It sits in NEDLAC at the moment, where an amendment to the Companies Act will hopefully require disclosure. And in South Africa as well, the median ratio between the median employee's salary and the CEO is not as important as the gap between the top and the bottom, right? Because of this vast gap we have as a society between those two ends. So there are proposed amendments to the Companies Act to require companies to disclose this information publicly, but there's a huge and strong lobby against that, as you can imagine, and that bill has been sitting in NEDLAC for a number of years now, as far as I'm aware, and hasn't yet seen the light of day. we hear a lot about benchmarking. Companies say we benchmark our salaries against PwC's X, Y, and Z report, whatever the case may be. But what does that actually mean? Where does that benchmark come from? What are we benchmarking against? Are you benchmarking only against the salaries of other CEOs, in which case there's only one direction that can go? Why do we not know more about what the cleaners and the security guards and the receptionists are earning, and all those temporary and contract workers who, by many accounts, from kind of research done by various academic institutions in this country, spend sort of 2/3 of their income on transport to and from work? There are huge inequities perpetuated by virtue of these pay gaps in the way pay is structured at these companies. But unless we know what those gaps are, it's very difficult to make progress.
Thank you so much, Tracey. I'm sure you've given everyone that's dialed in a lot of food for thought. And we have a quick couple of minutes, and you and I first connected actually discussing more climate change and the dirty emitters here in SA. So yourself at Just Share, I always get excited when your newsletter arrives on my inbox. What are some of the projects you're currently working on at the moment? I know when we last spoke, you spoke about the ships kind of feeding or wanting to feed power into our grid. But I'm very keen to hear what's happening in the environmental space as well.
Yeah, well, I think you may or may not be aware, actually, very interestingly, that as we speak, there's a case being heard in the Gauteng High Court, which is essentially environmental activists in Mpumalanga have launched a case against the government for completely failing to enforce the air quality laws in that province, and saying that is a violation of fundamental human rights, which I fully support and agree with. And that, of course, is due to the massive amounts of coal-fired power that is burnt in Mpumalanga and also Sasol's Secunda facility. So we are, as ever, focusing on financing, on banks. There are a lot of banks' AGMs coming up. We want to understand more about their policies to align their financing with the Paris goals, which all of them say they support. Are they still going to be planning on funding fossil fuels, and for how long into the future? And then, of course, there's always Sasol. The market is waiting on tenterhooks for Sasol's 2050 roadmap, in which it says it will set out its decarbonisation plan. Originally, that roadmap was supposed to be released in the first quarter of 2021, but we haven't seen it yet. So there'll be a lot of focus on that, and a lot of growing international focus on Sasol and its decarbonisation plan, as its big global investors become more concerned about the emissions from Secunda. So yeah, exciting times.
Thank you so much, Tracey. And yeah, we appreciate all the work that you guys are doing over at Just Share. And it's interesting that Sasol have their 2050 target. I think Germany just came out recently saying they want to be carbon neutral by 2040. So that's an entire nation. So if they can do it, maybe an SA corporate can do it as well.
Sasol doesn't have it yet. That's what we're all waiting for. Okay. they've committed to setting out a plan. So let's hope that it does commit to that.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. I know you're very pleased with what Nedbank produced from an energy policy point of view, and not to name or shame, but hopefully it sets a precedent, and we can even challenge ourselves to improve on that as well going forward. So Tracey, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a fantastic morning, and please feel free to stay in for our next session with Fadzi as well.
Will do. Thank you.
And from my side, we have another quick 1-minute clip, and when we come live again, we'll have Fadzi one day dialing in all the way from Geneva to spend the next 20 minutes with us, the last 20 minutes. Thank you.